Well, we're going to go ahead and get started again. This next session will be presentations on studies from the transportation corridor, which goes all the way from the mine site and includes the Cook Inlet side where the potential port site is located. We've got the three consultants from ABR Incorporated that I introduced yesterday. We're going to start off with Terry Schick, who's a specialist in birds, vegetation, and landscapes, and works on landscape approaches to habitat use studies and environmental impact assessments. And then Brian Lawhead will be next. He's been at ABR since '82, ADF&G and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service prior to that. Has done research in Alaska since 1975. Works on a wide variety of mammal and bird studies and environmental impact analyses. And then finally, Bob Day will finish it off. He's a senior scientist and principal at ABR. He's done environmental research in Alaska since '75. Most of it's ornithological, but he's also worked on a variety of other topics. And I would encourage people to, when you're watching these presentations, to, if there's anything that you want some clarification on or any comments that you'd like to make, to start thinking about that, because we will have another question and answer session later this afternoon. So Terry, are you ready?
Is working? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Today I'm going to talk briefly, basically very similar studies to what we conducted in the mine site for birds and habitat mapping. Yesterday we talked briefly about a wood frog study in the mine site. That was only done in the mine site. We don't have information on frog occurrence in the transportation corridor or in the Cook Inlet study areas. So we'll talk briefly about the mapped habitats in these two study areas, officially called the Transportation Corridor or Bristol Bay Drainages study area, and then over the watershed divide, the Cook Inlet Drainages study area. And as I mentioned, frogs were only surveyed in the mine area. We talked about methodology yesterday, so I'm not going to belabor that. I would point out, with respect to the discussion we had yesterday, that point count surveys with distance estimations are the standard accepted methodology for landbird and shorebird monitoring in Alaska. The Alaska Landbird Monitoring System, there's a web page there, has a lot of detailed information on protocols for this sort of monitoring. And a recent study by the Park Service, part of their inventory and monitoring program, conducted point count surveys in Lake Clark National Park and Katmai National Park, both north and south of the Pebble Project area, in similar habitats, and conducted point count surveys with distance estimates, as we did in the mine site. And their initial study results don't present density estimates because they have 1 year of data. They really don't have enough data to discuss densities yet, so they merely present average occurrence information as part of the inventory portion of that work, not yet moving into the monitoring phase. And that's equivalent to where we are in terms of our baseline studies. It's really inventory work. It's not monitoring work at this point in time. So the bird studies, again, this is similar to the mine site. In fact, these were basically the same surveys. They were just broken up into these different study areas. Baseline conditions were assessed for breeding raptors in '04 and '06, migrant and breeding water birds in 2004 and 2005. breeding shorebirds and landbirds during the point count surveys in 2005. And again, wildlife habitats ground-based work in 04 and 05. And then the mapping conducted in 2010 and 2011. So what did we find in the Bristol Bay drainages transportation corridor? Moving from the mine site, which is largely dominated by dwarf scrub habitats, you get into what could be called subalpine habitats of very open white spruce woodlands with an extensive lichen and dwarf or shrub birch understory. But the bulk of the transportation corridor is really dominated by mixed forests, spruce birch forests, largely open, some closed, but most of these are fairly open forests with extensive shrub understory. In the riverine drainages, there are poplar forests, poplar dominated, balsam poplar forests, some of these trees quite large. And of course, there are openings in the forest, both poorly drained openings in lowland areas and better drained, dwarf scrub dominated, well-drained openings at higher elevations. So in terms of wildlife habitats mapped in the transportation corridor, as I mentioned, the bulk of the area is dominated by forest, upland, and lowland spruce forest here at about 23% of the mapped area. Upland and lowland moist mixed forest, 40% of the mapped area. So definitely a forest-dominated landscape. And this is a depiction of the distribution of those habitat types. This is obviously a very linear corridor. This is a 2,000-foot wide corridor that was mapped along the transportation corridor. And the brownish colors are your forest habitat types. So what did we find in terms of bird species? In this transportation corridor and in study areas that were much broader around that narrow corridor that was mapped for habitats. So we surveyed for breeding raptors and water birds in particular in much broader expanses of habitat surrounding that narrow corridor. 99 species were recorded in 12 species groups. No threatened or endangered species were found. However, there are 18 species of conservation concern that were located in that area. Again, as with the mine site, you may recall from yesterday, definitely the system is dominated by passerines and waterfowl. Here's diurnal raptors, also fairly abundant in terms of number of species. Relative to the mine site, I would point out that the number of shorebirds is significantly lower, and that's largely due to the relative lack of open habitats in the forested landscapes in the transportation corridor. So in terms of raptors, 14 species were observed, and a set of 4 of those were quite common, as opposed to the mine site. We find osprey, common in the transportation corridor. Bald eagle, again, was also the most common species in the mine site, and again, it's the most common species in the transportation corridor. Golden eagles were also found in this area, nesting on cliff faces, and common raven, not a raptor, but a cliff nesting species, and raptors use raven nests in subsequent years, so they are indicative of raptor use. So 4 species very common, the rest of them uncommon to rare in this area. In terms of water birds, 34 species were recorded in 10 species groups. 9 of these were migrants moving through the area completely to breed elsewhere, and 25 of those species were recorded as migrants and/or breeders. So some of these species migrate through the area, or some individuals migrate through the area to breed elsewhere. Many remain and breed in water bodies associated or along the transportation corridor. Again, ducks are the dominant species as in the mine site. In this case, both dabbling and diving ducks are represented. The dabblers, American widgeon, mallard, northern pintail, green-winged teal, very common. And the divers, greater scaup, common goldeneye, and the fish eater, red-breasted merganser, were quite common in terms of the waterbird communities. Here's the shorebird list. This is half the number of species that were observed in the mine site, some of them the same. Most definitely the system was dominated by greater yellowlegs and Wilson snipe, significantly more abundant than the other 5 species recorded here. And this, as I mentioned, is undoubtedly due to the lack of open habitats, the relative lack of open habitats in the forested landscape in the transportation corridor. And then the landbird species numbers go way up when you get into a forested landscape. 46 species were recorded in 18 different species groups, everything from grouse and ptarmigan, chickadees, nuthatches, warblers, waxwings, sparrows, blackbirds, a bunch of other species that do not occur in the open habitats in the mine site. The system's dominated, again, by some of the same groups, thrushes, warblers, and sparrows, and then a single species of kinglet is exceedingly common in this forested landscape. The ruby-crowned kinglet was very common. Swainson's thrush, hermit thrush, American robin, varied thrush, orange-crowned warbler, yellow-rumped warbler, Wilson's warbler, golden-crowned sparrow, dark-eyed junco were far more common than the other species. And there are we see about 6 species of conservation concern here. Some of these represented by very few observations. I think we saw a single rusty blackbird in this area, for example. So shifting then across the watershed divide to Cook Inlet drainages, where all the streams drain the other way into Lower Cook Inlet. The system is very simple compared to the other drainages on the other side of the watershed divide. The area is dominated definitely by tall alder thickets from the coastline all the way up to subalpine, right below open dwarf scrub and glacier habitats along the coast. There are many other habitat types there. We mapped 20 different habitat types, but they occur in small pockets and cover very small portions of the area that was mapped. So upland tall alder scrub here covers some 81% of the mapped area along the, it's the transportation corridor segment that occurs in Cook Inlet drainages, which is represented here. So what you're looking at here, the dark brown, is your upland tall alder scrub right along the coast. So in this region, the species diversity in terms of birds drops fairly dramatically. In the terrestrial and freshwater habitats that were surveyed here, Bob Day will talk about what occurs in marine habitats offshore. But in terrestrial and freshwater aquatic habitats, 49 species were recorded in 5 different species groups. No threatened and endangered species were found, but 7 species of conservation concern were located. And again, passerines, the dominant group. Waterfowl also relatively numerous in terms of number of species. You've seen here that shorebirds have dropped out completely. Many of the other groups have similarly have dropped out. 6 species of owl or raptors, including owls, were recorded, and not surprisingly for a coastal area, bald eagle, again, the most common breeding raptor species in this area. New for the Cook Inlet drainages study areas, peregrine falcon, they were recorded nesting in this area. Also golden eagle, sometimes more associated with inland areas, but also nesting in cliff faces in the coastal regions here in the Cook Inlet drainages. Waterbirds, the numbers have dropped here. We've got 14 species in the Cook Inlet drainages. Again, mostly dabbling ducks, a few divers, the fish-eater red-breasted merganser, one of the very common species, and then the set of dabbling ducks here, widgeon, mallard, shoveler, pintail, and green-winged teal. Glaucous-winged gulls were quite common in migration in this area in freshwater aquatic habitats. Of course, they breed then during the summer months in marine habitats. Shorebirds, only 2 were seen, and neither were really in terrestrial or freshwater habitats. Black oystercatcher and short-billed dowitcher were recorded, but they were recorded in intertidal marine habitats, which Bob Day will discuss later. Land birds, compared to the 46 species in the Bristol Bay Transportation Corridor, Bristol Bay drainages, only 30 species were found in 11 different species groups here in Cook Inlet drainages. Again, dominated by some of the same species: thrushes, warblers, and sparrows, hermit thrush, orange-crowned warbler, yellow warbler, Wilson's warbler, Savannah sparrow, and golden-crowned sparrow were far more common than most of the other species. And that's all I have in terms of an overview and summary. And Brian will talk about the mammal fauna.
Can you switch that? Go here. And then pull yours up. There we go.
Okay.
And then go there to the full screen right there.
Let me get some water here. All right, I'm going to be continuing the talk that I gave yesterday. It's a different emphasis today. I'm trying to keep it short because Bob Day has a lot of material to cover for the marine area. Again, this is going to focus on the transportation corridor and the Cook Inlet drainages. I'll quickly review some of the same slides I had yesterday and try to focus more on the transportation corridor and the Cook Inlet side, the marine side. We reviewed existing information, reports, publications that we could find in the area. As background, we conducted surveys to assess seasonal distribution abundance of selected species. We summarized the existing population survey telemetry information that we could locate or through a cooperative agreement with the Mulchatna Caribou Herd Technical Working Group, and collaborated with the Department of Fish and Game on bear surveys, and also to a certain extent with National Marine Mammal Lab on seal surveys in Iliamna Lake. We used several local observers early on in the surveys, and then we compiled incidental observations from other workers and project personnel, other contractors. Again, we were focusing on the larger species of that have a high level of human use: caribou, brown bear, moose, harbor seal, beaver. We reviewed information for all species in the report. We conducted, in the transportation corridor, we conducted surveys only in 2004 and 2005. May have been one in 2006. In the transportation corridor, we used a lower intensity of survey transects. It was more of a sampling approach, and used a double count detectability assessment for sightability from the aircraft. And then, because of the constraints of terrain in the eastern portion of the transportation corridor, we restricted our surveys to overflights of the corridor itself. We conducted quadrat surveys, random quadrat surveys using the geostatistical population estimator the Department of Fish and Game has developed in April 2010. We did a line transect sampling with the Department of Fish and Game, a survey that was led by Earl Becker, using distance sampling. We looked at bears along salmon spawning streams, both as a dedicated survey and as incidental to similar surveys for harlequin ducks. We did some bear den checks by helicopter, but we didn't really locate any dens in this area. It doesn't mean they're not there. It means they're difficult to locate. Thick alder slopes, and not as much coverage as in the mine area. Just led to a lower detection. But it's notable that brown bears in this area den heavily along the coast. It's an area where there's a real strong precipitation gradient going from the mine out to the coast, and there's lots more snow at the coast, and good denning conditions there. And then farther south, there have been some studies that have shown extensive movements away from the coast inland after denning. We conducted a survey of beaver colonies in the transportation corridor in October 2006, and we conducted surveys of harbor seal haulouts in Iliamna Lake in conjunction with marine seal surveys. These were done in 2005, 2007, and 2008. Real briefly, I mentioned the Mulchatney caribou herd. This is the caribou herd range map I showed yesterday. The outer extent of this may be the 99% distribution contour. I'm not certain. I don't think it's every location, but you'll notice that they fall off right about here, right about the New Halen River. So, and the transportation corridor we're talking about is east over here to the coast. So not many caribou records in that area. This is a map I didn't show yesterday. This shows the various telemetry locations from that long-term data set. The red dots are individual caribou locations, and you can see they fall off really quickly as you get east of the mine area. Again, the transportation corridor area is this area in the blue outline. This was surveyed for moose in April 2010, and then the May 2009 bear survey occurred within this much larger red outlined area. This red line here denotes the change in drainage between the Bristol Bay drainages and the Cook Inlet drainages. So again, it was a collaborative effort with Fish and Game. And the estimate was for the entire area shown in that last slide. So because of the nature of the method, it wasn't possible to identify a density gradient, but the understanding is that the density of black bears or brown bears at the coast is much higher than farther inland. The same method was used by the National Park Service in a previous year. It was probably 5 or 6 years before we did the survey for this project. and they came up with 150 brown bears per 1,000 square kilometers, 85 black bears per 1,000 square kilometers. This is the distribution of sightings from the survey done for this project, and again, the yellow dots are the brown bears, red dots are black bears here, here, here. And you'll see that the black bears are more common in the more forested areas to the east, and that's consistent with previous surveys that found much higher densities of black bears going north from Iliamna Lake. And this is graphics a little fuzzy. This is not from Pebble work, but this is from the comparable survey done by the Park Service in 2007, and this just shows you the distribution of, well, the area that they surveyed. So it's the Cook Inlet drainage area. And then these are distributions of brown bear sightings and then black bears. And you see the black bears fall out really rapidly south of the Aniskin Peninsula. Moose population survey was the same approach, randomly selected quadrats below 3,000 feet in elevation with intensive search methods. And you see that moose are more common in the transportation corridor than in the mine study area, particularly here in Checock area and here on the Pile River. There's a fair number of moose in fairly small sample units. The light blue are areas where no moose were found. So in April, you expect to find concentrations of moose in lowland riparian corridors. This is not unexpected. You can see here just the difference. Sample units, these are the mine area, very few moose, quite a few more in the transportation corridor, both inside and outside sample units, and the density was higher, the number was higher, twice as many moose estimated. This illustrates a change in approach. In 2004, there were a number of different corridors being potentially considered. They were weeded out pretty quickly, and in 2005, we switched from these reconnaissance overflights of individual corridors to more of a systematic strip transect sampling with double counts. Except in this area, you see here the terrain becomes much more mountainous, more constrained, not conducive to those types of surveys. Again, this is a little difficult to see. It's a fairly busy map, but it shows the distribution of brown bears throughout the area in different months. And other mammals as well, moose, coyote, red fox, beaver colonies. Not many were found, but the survey was constrained to a fairly narrow corridor. Also sightings of otters, wolf, and wolverine. Harbor seal surveys. Harbor seal, Iliamna Lake is an interesting place. It's the site of the only freshwater seal population in Alaska. Of course, seals are covered under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, so they're of permitting concern for this project. They're known to be susceptible to disturbance when hauled out during pupping or during molt. Again, as I said, it's the only freshwater seal population known in Alaska. There are others elsewhere in Hudson Bay drainages in Canada. And Bob will talk about the seals in the coastal bays. This is an example of a haul out being used in summer, and this is an example of a cluster of seals near a crack in the ice in winter, in February or March. In the first year, in 2005, we surveyed in every month between March and December, except for November, to try and get a picture of the seasonal peaks in use. And it peaked in August and began to increase in May, June, July, September, but peaked in August. 2007, we shortened the survey period a little bit from May to October, and again, the peaks were in August. So in 2008, we focused on August and did more surveys, or compressed the surveys into a shorter time period to try and get an idea of maximum numbers in a short time frame at the time of year when the numbers peaked. And basically we found that I think the maximum count was 357 seals counted on at haulouts. I'll go back to that. That was in, these are averages here. But the peak count in 2008 was 357, but the variance from day to day is enormous. It can go, there was a difference of over 100, 120, 130 seals from one day to the next. So highly variable haul-out use. It's not as easy to survey these animals as it is in the marine environment because there are well-developed models for how many seals haul out in relation to tide, time of day, things like that. In the marine environment, it's not well understood in the freshwater environment. That's one area that the National Marine Mammal Lab is looking at now in current work. And I should also mention this population has been, the National Marine Fisheries Service has been petitioned to list it under the Endangered Species Act, so it's under a status review now. But even at the time, there was concern on the part of the National Marine Fisheries Service about a number of different groups surveying the seals, so they asked surveyors, or the different survey groups, to consolidate their efforts. And that's been done in a cooperative survey program, I think, between National Marine Mammal Lab and Bristol Bay Native Association, I believe, and UAA. Yep. I was trying to think of one of the village corporations. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Thank you. So that effort has continued, and Pebble has kind of stepped out of that. Survey areas in the Cook Inlet drainages. Again, the surveys were pretty much confined to overflights of the corridor. The green was in 2004, and then and after that, in 2005, it consolidated here. This was an early idea about potential power line transmission that's since been abandoned. So for mammals, for terrestrial mammals, the highlight of the Cook Inlet drainages is an intense number of brown bears. Very strong seasonal concentrations in Upper Niskin Bay. This is a pretty well-known phenomenon along the Alaska Peninsula coast. They gather in sedge marshes, salt marshes in the springtime to feed on newly emerging vegetation, and you can get some really impressive concentrations. I think the highest number we found on a single survey was in the head of Niskin Bay. We saw 92 bears within a 4.5-mile stretch, and those are just the ones we saw. And there's thick alder thickets on both sides. It's very impressive. Similar over here in Chinitna Bay, we only surveyed the southern coast. The northern coast is in Lake Clark National Park, and this is kind of a well-known bear watching area over here. And there are a few hunting camps in these areas during the seasons when that's open, alternate years. So, and the other concentrations here, you can see here in July, where brown bears feeding on salmon runs. There's an anadromous run here and some over in here. And again, incidental sightings of other mammals. There are moose in the Niskin Peninsula and in this what's called the Y Valley, and scattered throughout the coastal areas. Fox, river otter, wolf, and wolverine sightings in this area as well. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Bob.
Okay. Good morning. I'm going to be talking about the marine wildlife studies that we started conducting in 2004. And these are all the co-authors who've been involved with extensive amounts of field work with me on this project. The primary objective really is was to look at birds or mammals classified as threatened, endangered, or of conservation concern occurred in the marine waters of the Cook Inlet study area. And I have the unenviable position of having all of the threatened and endangered species that occur in the entire Pebble Project occur in my study area. So these include Steller's eiders and Kittlitz's merlets, both birds. Stellers are threatened. There's a very small breeding population that occurs in northern Alaska. And Kittlitz's merlet is what's called a candidate species under the Endangered Species Act. And it is actually undergoing review right now. There will be a preliminary listing decision published, I believe, by the end of September this year, and a final decision will be published by the end of next year. And then we have several species of marine mammals that are involved with Endangered Species Act. Sea otters are listed as threatened. This is the Southwest Alaska population. Stellar sea lions, the western population, these are endangered. And in my professional career, I've undergone dramatic population declines, especially in the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Islands. Belugas, these are the Cook Inlet stock that recently were listed as threatened. And then gray whales are pretty insignificant in this area, but they were protected under the Endangered Species Act for many years and are listed as, they're delisted right now. In addition, we also wanted to describe the seasonal distribution and abundance of birds and mammals in the Cook Inlet study area, and if possible, to look at breeding by seabirds and mammals in this area. This shows the study area over the 5 years. The emphasis is really on Iliamna and Niskin Bays and this bight out here in front of them. This area, this is the northern part of what's called Kamishak Bay, which is a very large bay on western side of Cook Inlet. It extends from clear down near the mouth of the inlet up here to the Niskin Peninsula. And then in 05, 6, 7, and 8, we did some sampling up here in Chinitna Bay, as Brian indicated. Now this area it's a quite interesting area. It's formerly glaciated, and that's what these valleys are here, these fjords, but an enormous amount of sediment has dropped in into the bottom, and so these are there are extensive mud flats over most of these bays. There's a very narrow channel that runs up into about here in Niskin Bay, and a narrow channel that runs into about here in Iliamna Bay. Otherwise, at low tide, much of this area, if not all of it, is exposed mud flats. It's some of the hairiest boating I've ever done. Very difficult to do small boat work in this area, and it's very difficult to do large boat work because you can't really get into the bays very well. There also are some remnant glaciers, for example, up the Niskin River Valley. There are a few here and a few on some of these mountain tops, and this comes into play with some discussions that I talk about later. So we used altogether across the 5-year period, we used 4 different sampling methods. We started out using boat-based wildlife surveys in 04 to 06. And in 04, 05, we also did some fixed-wing bird surveys that were looking at spring and fall migration. I'll talk about those. Starting in 06, we started doing helicopter-based wildlife surveys, and we sampled over 26 periods during that 3-year period. And then we also did some fixed-wing surveys for harbor seals in 2005, 7, and 8. So the boat-based wildlife surveys these are quite standard. These are really the basis upon which much of the Exxon Valdez work that was done. These are quite commonly used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS in various places in Alaska. And we conducted these year-round. We started in early summer of 2004. And we did them 2 surveys per period over the 2 years. So we did early summer 04, late fall, early winter 04, late winter, spring, early summer, and late fall of 05. And then we finished up in late winter and spring of 06. So between early summer of 04 and 06, we did a total of 8 surveys. We do a complete nearshore survey, basically and this is the standard, is equal to or less than 200 meters from shore, what's on the shoreline, and within 100 meters of the coast. You do a subsample of the offshore survey area. It's much too difficult, much too large to survey extensively. And as I indicated, it became one of the things we realized after a while was that it was quite difficult to survey these large offshore areas because we couldn't get boats into them. It's quite difficult boating, as I indicated. These emphasized only the Ilion, the Niskin area, and while we were doing the surveys during the summer, we attempted to record breeding birds or colonies, but we didn't actually go up onto the nesting areas at the time. This shows you our survey area. We surveyed from Ursus Head down here in the southern end, and these blue bars mark our shoreline segments. So you can see there are various ones here going up through Ilion the Bay, another one here, one at North Head, and so on throughout the area, all the way over almost to Oil Bay. And then the offshore islands, this is called White Gull Island, and this is Black Reef area. So this became one stratum. And then the other one is we call the Niskin Islands. And this is a place that you're going to hear me talk about a lot. This is a really very interesting set of islands that I think are of great importance to marine wildlife of all types. The fixed wing surveys, we started in spring of '04. We surveyed spring and fall. And in '04, '05, we added a few more in the fall to get us sampling from about mid-August until almost mid-October. And these counted from shore to 500 meters offshore, and then there were large groups of birds sometimes seen in the centers of bays, and we would go out and sample those. These are the information on the flight speed and altitude. And in '05, we added Chinook in the Bay. So this shows you the survey area. And as you can see, we surveyed, again, because it was interested in particular parts of these bays in '04, we started surveying only parts of them, and then we expanded to the entire area and added Chinitna in '05. Starting in early '06, we started doing helicopter-based surveys as a pilot study because we became concerned that we were not adequately surveying these large offshore areas in the bays. So we started doing helo surveys. We became satisfied with them. We like I said, we did it as a pilot study in '06, and we were pretty satisfied. So we started doing an extensive set of them in '07, and we continued on into '08 when we had to discontinue because of some issues related to marine mammal permits. We used a Robinson R-44, great little helicopter, very good viewing conditions, very efficient in terms of fuel consumption. And we surveyed normally around 60 meters, but if we saw certain species such as sea lions, marine mammals in particular, we were very concerned about potential for disturbance, and so we would either increase altitude or veer off on our flight path to reduce the chances of disturbing marine mammals in particular. These surveys also avoid low tides because this is a period when harbor seals haul out in greatest numbers. So we try to avoid doing any surveying at all within 2 hours on either side of low tides. We do a complete nearshore survey and then a partial offshore survey, groups of 5 or more birds, we recorded them. And Steller's eiders and sea otters, we recorded everything. No matter where we saw them, we would veer off on our track to survey them. So this gives you an idea of the area. We did just Iliamna and Niskin in '06, and then we added Chinitna in '07 and '08. And I will also be talking about, in some cases, whether something is inside or outside of the bay, because I think these bays versus the bight have very different habitats, and this just shows you the boundaries of what we use for what was inside versus outside of the bays. Finally, for the seal surveys, Brian and Alex took the lead on this, and they used a 206 or a Super Cub. They emphasize surveying within 2 hours of low tide because, as I said, that's the time when the greatest number of seals tend to haul out. And these are surveys that consistently used haul outs. Occasionally, there are other haul outs that I'll show you that were occasionally used, such as mud flats, but those animals moved around a fair amount. We estimated the group sizes and then photographed them for later counting on the computers, and we mapped locations. So this shows you the harbor seal survey, and you can see that out here on the Niskin Islands, this is where an awful lot of the records occurred. And on a lot of these rocky islands and small rocks that are exposed at low tide into Iliamna Bay, this is all mud flats in upper part of Niskin Bay, right off of these two streams that actually are anadromous fish streams. And this seems to be a really preferred area for these animals to haul out. And then up in Chinitna Bay, this is an island with a large spit on it that has a fair number of seals, and then occasionally at low tide you'll see seals hauled out on the flats farther in Chinitna Bay itself. And I'll be talking about each of these different strata. This is what we call the Iliamna Bay stratum, the Niskin Bay, the Niskin Islands, and then Chinitna Bay. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. So this is just a summary of the effort that we put in over the years to show you the sampling effort that we did. The fixed wheel, or the fixed wing seal surveys, really, we started out, like Brian said, the first year we surveyed a large number of surveys over a very long period of time because we weren't exactly sure what the timing of some of this phenology was for the seals. When did they haul out in greatest numbers? So we started in March, Brian, and went through, I think, November or into early December, something like that. And once we got a better feel for what the seasonal pattern might be, in 2007 and 2008, we were able to shrink that survey period down, as I'll be talking about. So I'm going to talk about the birds first because this is my main passion. Over the 8 boat-based surveys, we counted about 59,000 birds of at least 67 species. These give some really high-resolution information on birds that are there. We also, we did about 20 fixed-wing surveys, and we recorded about 72,000 birds of at least 31 species on those, and 26 helicopter-based surveys, and we recorded over 67,000 birds of at least 41 species on those. What I'm going to do is tell you how I think the community fits together, what are the main features of it, and I'm going to use data from one or more of these various sampling types to help make the point that I'm trying to. Overall, the HELO data are what I'm going to emphasize because that's what we had some really nice year-round data sets on. So what can we say about total abundance in the Iliamna and Niskin area? And you'll see I have asterisks here for periods when we did not do an actual survey. Each year is indicated by a different color. The white bars, such as here, here, and here, and these three were the 2006 surveys. All the gray bars are 2007, and the black bars are 2008. Now, what we did was the real emphasis was from fall, early fall through late winter, early spring, because that's when most of these endangered animals are in this area in number. So we emphasize those. We try to stay out of there during the summer breeding period for seals and so on. And what you see is a dramatic seasonal pattern of abundance. You get a spring migration of birds moving through this area, as we've seen in early May 2007. But by far the peak counts that we see actually on a helicopter are in late August, early September. And this matches up exactly with what we saw with our fixed wing bird surveys in this area. Our peak was, at times we had over 11,000 birds on the fixed wing surveys. And so we had over 5,000 in this area on the HELO based surveys. Once fall migration ends, numbers drop dramatically farther in the fall as you head toward winter. And then you start seeing birds moving into the bays. And these are the overwintering birds. A lot of sea ducks come into this area. And this is a common feature in wintering bird communities along the coast in Alaska. The sea ducks really do tend to dominate all of these areas that I've ever worked in the winter. Midwinter life can be kind of tough. Numbers can be a bit variable at times, especially sometime in March we'll often see a drop in numbers. And this seems to be associated with something I'll show you a little bit later, which is sometimes it becomes so cold that these bays freeze. One or both bays will actually freeze, and it forces the birds and mammals to actually move out of the bays, and so numbers drop. And then in late late winter, early spring, you start seeing numbers peak again as you're starting to see the wintering birds are starting to move out, and the first spring migrants are starting to come through. And then you see again in May, numbers will increase dramatically. Species richness, we also see a dramatic seasonal pattern. Again, it's the axes and are the same sort of thing. But we see the peak occur in the spring. And this is because birds really push in the spring. They're pushing hard to get to the breeding grounds as quickly as they can. Whereas in the fall, the peak number of species tends to be lower because they actually wait for better weather often to migrate. They'll just dribble through an area. And we see this in the interior, we see it along the coast, and so on. But in the spring, you can often get a large number of species jammed into some of these bays. And again, you can see as the birds start leaving the area, the species richness drops, and then it starts increasing again as you get the overwintering birds coming into this area. So you have the last of the fall migrants or resident birds, and then you have an influx of birds coming in for overwintering. And mid to late winter, numbers tend to be fairly stable but drop a little bit again right around this March period. I think this is maybe associated with this often freezing conditions that we see, and then they increase again right on through spring as we start seeing movements of wintering birds and movements of migrant birds through the area. Now, one point here is this is only 25 species. When you look at the boat-based data, the maximal number we recorded on the nearshore survey is almost 50 species. And that's because there are a lot of these marine-oriented birds are quite small, especially shorebirds. They're quite difficult to tell apart. And what you do is you may have 20 species of shorebirds in the bay, and all you can tell from the helicopter is I have large shorebirds and small shorebirds. Whereas with a boat, you can take your time and you get much higher resolution data, but the pattern is basically the same. Your high numbers are in the spring, and then the number of species declines through time. The other pattern that you see is the offshore area tends to have fewer species than the nearshore area does. It's a much simpler system in terms of a bird community, but the same pattern holds. Well, what is this bird community like? For those of you sitting in the audience, I'm sure what you basically are seeing in most cases are either blue bars or yellow bars. This is a pretty simple community dominated by a few groups. The blue bars are waterfowl, especially sea ducks. The yellow bars are seabirds, which includes gulls and things such as puffins and murres and those sorts of things, cormorants. And so what you see is, on a seasonal basis, what becomes the dominant group varies. So during the summer months, here, for example, April to October of 06, seabirds are the dominant group. So as you get into the winter, the blue bars, which are the waterfowl, there are enormous numbers of wintering waterfowl in this area. And so they become the dominant birds in the wintering community. Now, occasionally you get these large bars that are red. These are the shorebirds. And the shorebirds are, you really do have to hit the numbers correctly. There are very substantial numbers of shorebirds that come through this area, but over a very narrow window in the spring. Otherwise, they're not here in very large numbers. Now, you do have an exception here. For example, this bar here, that's November of 06. There was a very strong blow shortly before we got there, and we think it forced many of the birds out of the area. So the main birds that were in this area were a few flocks of wintering shorebirds, wintering rock sandpipers. And so the total number was very low of all birds, and it turned out to be dominated at that time by sandpipers. But overall, you see this seasonal pattern of seabirds, mostly in the summer months, and then waterfowl in the winter months are dominating. So the system changes back and forth and back and forth. And we see this in places like Prince William Sound and on the Kenai Peninsula. Prince William Sound, I've spent a lot of time doing work in, and it's a fairly boring place in the summer. The winter is really when the action is there. It's really dominated by these sea duck communities. You see a similar pattern With the boat-based data, again, you got in your fall and winter months, you have the system's dominated by sea ducks or by waterfowl. In the summer months, it's usually dominated by seabirds. However, you can see this one bar in spring of '06 that is an enormous number of shorebirds. And we happened to hit the peak. We were trying to hit both years the peak of shorebird migration through this area. We missed, like I said, this is only about a 1-week period, and it's right around the time when they have the Homer Shorebird Festival. If you ever get a chance to go down, it's really neat to go see this enormous numbers of birds. At the same time, we catch this passage coming across Cook Inlet, and they hang out on the mudflats on the western side, and then presumably go up over the mountains and on into Bristol Bay to breeding areas in western Alaska. It's a very narrow window, and we missed it apparently by a couple of days in '05, but we hit it in '06 when we had over 20,000 shorebirds on these mudflats. Otherwise, the other main groups that are in this area, the water birds, are your loons and grebes, your raptors, your eagles, and so on, and the corvids, the ravens, the magpies, the northwestern crows, and so on, are really insignificant parts of this bird community. So it really is dominated mostly by waterfowl and seabirds, and occasionally, and for very brief periods of time, it's dominated by shorebirds. Again, we see a similar pattern with the fixed wing data. In the spring, it's a little bit more waterfowl than seabirds, but they're about half and half. And in the fall, it's much more waterfowl moving into this area. But again, in spring of '05, they hit that peak of shorebird migration too. So what about the composition of this community? It really is primarily waterfowl overall. And seabirds are second in abundance. So about 71% of all the birds that we recorded were waterfowl, and 93% of those were diving ducks. So basically, 2 out of every 3 bird you see out there on an annual basis is some kind of a diving duck. And it really boils down to 6 species. There are 3 species of scoters. There's long-tailed ducks, Steller's eiders, and harlequin ducks. So basically, 2 out of every 3 birds is one of these 6 species that occur out there. About 26% of the birds were seabirds, and 94% of those were gulls. So that means that about 23-24% of all birds that you see are either 6 species of ducks, of waterfowl, sea ducks, or mostly glaucous-winged gulls, which occur here in large numbers. So you're talking roughly around 90+% is basically on the order of 7 or 8 species of the birds that occur in this area. The rest are fairly low in abundance, except, as I said, for the shorebirds, which occur in enormous numbers in a very brief period in the spring. I just want to show you some maps showing density areas, and you can see the scale ranges from 0 to 675. This is during late summer through fall, and I have marked in these red circles, there's a total of 8 of them, 6 in Aniskin and Iliamna, and 2 in Chinitna Bay, and these are anadromous fish streams coming off the Fish and Game website. And what you see is that on something like 5 or 6 of these 8 areas, you have high densities of birds concentrated around these anadromous fish streams. This was one exception. We just never saw many birds up in that area. So as you go into the middle of winter, one thing you see is the change. If you look again, the changes, you have much, with the exception of this area, the east arm of Aniskin Bay, you have much lower numbers of birds. The total peak density is much lower, and you have much less association with these anadromous fish streams. So I would assume that we're talking salmon runs, salmon carcasses, perhaps young salmon coming out of the streams. This may be what these birds are concentrating on in the fall, but by the middle of winter, that source of food is gone, and numbers tend to drop quite a bit, and they really are out in these more offshore areas. This is a shoal out here, an extensive shoal that we always wanted to survey with a boat, but we couldn't do it, so we had to switch to the helicopters to collect that sort of information. You can also see that the Aniskin Islands, in general, this area has pretty high densities. They had high densities in the fall, midwinter, and in the spring. Again, you see large, very high densities. Now what you see then in the spring, March through May, late winter, early spring, into spring, is very little association with these anadromous fish streams, but there are a couple here. Now I would assume that there are things such as eulicon that make runs in this area, and so there may be, to some extent, there may be an association, especially those birds later on, coming in looking for eulicon. This area also has a herring run. So to some extent, there may be an association with herring that I'll talk about. But what is the overall pattern that we see? And what we see is that most of the birds in this area are concentrated inside the bays in winter. I think this is perhaps associated with protection from weather. Kamishak Bay is a pretty tough place. It's very exposed. Any storms in the Gulf of Alaska blow into Kamishak Bay, which is on the western side of the inlet. These are lows, and so you'll tend to get easterly winds in that area. They make it very difficult place to make a living. You also have extensive tidal range. You have tides going in, you have tides going out, and the winds often blow either up and down, up the inlet or down the inlet. So it's and then finally, the fourth thing that birds have to deal with is the ice that comes down from in the upper part of the inlet. I think the last part of the birds before I get to the endangered species I want to talk about is just to mention the breeding bird information. Back in 1976 to 78, some folks during the OCSEP studies went out here and actually spent quite a bit of time trying to census nesting seabirds in this area. And these circles show the main colonies. This was a glaucous-winged gull colony, a pretty substantial colony, but the Aniskin Islands and White Gull Island and the area around the Wye Valley, this really is the main area where most of the birds were nesting in those days. There was essentially nothing nesting in Cottonwood Bay. Now we went out, like I said, we didn't do extensive breeding bird surveys, but what we see is a similar pattern today. Most of the birds are concentrated in this arc out here along the islands around the edge of the bight. This colony of glaucous-winged gulls has essentially disappeared. I'm not quite sure why. My suspicions would be that there are perhaps otters or mink, which are common predators on seabirds. We do see river otters out there. They're quite good climbers that can get up on these islands. The other thing is that puffins nested out here in large numbers in the old days, and their populations have declined quite a bit. So this is a slide showing numbers that were seen back in the 70s of estimated numbers of breeding birds in this area. And then these are the total numbers of birds of each of these species that we saw. So this would assume that every bird that we saw out there was a breeding bird, to show you the best case scenario of what's going on now. And what we see is that for most of these species, the ones that are marked in yellow, we've seen dramatic population declines. Double-crested cormorants, about 150 were estimated to have been nesting in the old days, and the most we've recorded has been 74 birds in the entire area. I think we saw one nest. Pelagic cormorant numbers seem to be pretty steady. Common eiders formerly were there in larger numbers, and we saw very few out here between 04 and 06 on the boat-based surveys. Black oyster catcher numbers, these are common shorebirds along the shoreline. They seem to be fairly stable, but the other ones, the glaucous-winged gulls, the pigeon guillemots, tufted and horned puffins, have all shown dramatic population decline, especially the tufted puffins, whose populations appear to have declined by on the order of 95%. Now, concomitant with this, there's been a decline in the herring population in this area. This was a major herring spawning area in the 90s, and the population really went downhill quite badly in the 90s, and it's remained fairly low since then. The last few years, I think there's starting to be evidence that they're spawning over. The populations may be going up, the spawning is starting to occur over broader areas and so on. So it's going to be very interesting to see if the puffins in particular start to come back, or if there's some other reason why their populations have shown such dramatic declines. Now, we also, on the other hand, had two species that the guys didn't even record breeding in the old days, red-faced cormorant and mew gull. We've seen a few mugulls breeding, especially in the upper part in Cottonwood Bay area. And the red-faced cormorants are a very odd bird. Their center of abundance is the Aleutian Islands and the Bering Sea. And in the 60s, for some reason, their population showed a dramatic range expansion eastward into the Gulf of Alaska, all the way to Prince William Sound, where Pete Islebe in those days thought that they were the most abundant cormorant that was there, which is hard for me to envision because they've since then shown a dramatic retraction of their range westward again. And they're quite rare in Prince William Sound, and they're actually not very common in this area. It's possible that a few of the nests that we had cormorants don't reproduce very well, and their nests are about the same size as those of pelagic cormorants. So we see all these empty nests. We were never able to be certain that there were red-faced cormorants nesting there, but there are birds there in the summer, and there's a very good possibility that a few of them may try to nest at times. Okay, so Steller's eider is the threatened species, and they breed in northern Alaska and across northeastern Russia, northeastern north central Russia. They winter down in Bering Sea, especially along the Alaska Peninsula and around into the Gulf of Alaska. We have there's a pretty good sized population that occurs in Kamishak Bay in general, but where our bays, study bays are, is at the pretty much the northern end of the range on the western side of Cook Inlet. You can see that spring and summer, they basically are absent from the area, and they really don't start showing up until mid to late November. There are a few records from the Fish and Wildlife Service into October. They then are found throughout most of the midwinter and late winter, disappearing usually by the middle of April. Numbers are fairly variable, but overall you're talking on the order of 200 to 300 birds in most cases. Wintering in this area, the peak we had was about 675. And they're very odd ducks in that they hang out by themselves. They really don't like to mix in with other sea ducks. This is a map showing locations of all records, and all of these records that we have are based on helicopter-based data, except for a couple that we had from the boat-based surveys. And what you can see is that the main wintering area is over this shallow bank, the shoal that you see in lower Iniskin Bay. That's where the bulk of the population occurs. And then right at this intersection of Cottonwood Bay and Iliamna Bay is the other area. And that seemed to be starting to be used in 07 and 08. But the bulk of the birds occur in lower Iniskin. And this matches up quite well with some historical data that Bill Larned from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service collected down in this area in 04-05, and you can see that again most of his birds were within the bay and just a few flocks outside. He had one record in Chinitna, and I don't know if we never did have a record in Chinitna. And as you might expect, essentially it's over 99% of the birds occur within the bays. These birds, like most of the sea ducks, like to stay in the bays rather than being outside where it's more exposed. Now, the other species that's associated with the endangered species list is the Kittlitz's merlet. This actually is undergoing evaluation for listing right now. We didn't record any in our study area, although we did have a couple of unidentified Brachyrhamphus merlets in this area on the boat-based surveys. They also actually stage in the fall. They've done some satellite telemetry work for birds from the central and eastern part of the Gulf of Alaska, and several of them have gone over and stopped near Augustine Island, which is out in this open bight off of our main study areas, and then they continue on into the Bering and Chukchi Seas in late summer and fall. So they are in this area, we just did not actually record them. The habitat's also similar to that used elsewhere in northern Gulf of Alaska, glaciated or formerly glaciated habitats, quite turbid water, and so on. So they are possible in this area in low numbers, but I emphasize that we did not have any definite records of this species. So in summary for the birds, we've recorded at least 69 species of marine-oriented birds occur or probably occur in this area. This includes this Kittlitz's merlet. The species richness is highest in the spring and fall migration, lowest in mid to late winter, and this is a common thing you see in the open Gulf of Alaska, you see in Prince William Sound, and so on. The community is dominated numerically by waterfowl and seabirds, with many shorebirds in spring, and then sometimes you get some pretty good-sized overwintering flocks of rock sandpipers. Large numbers of waterfowl migrate through this area. On those fixed-wing surveys, the peak we had on one survey was over 8,600 birds in late August, early September. This is also an important molting and wintering area for scoters and long-tailed ducks. And then long-tailed ducks and harlequin ducks molt here also, and then Steller's eiders. We recorded 19 species of conservation concern. The review panel, I'm sure you had to read through all that stuff. I don't even want to talk about it. It will take far more time than I have to discuss the other species. And it's used by substantial concentrations of wintering birds. And as I indicated, I think there's pretty clear evidence for a decline in populations of breeding birds, especially puffins in this area. Like I said, I assume that it's probably related to the decline in the herring population. But we also have seen evidence of brown bears going out onto these islands and digging up puffins from their burrows. So the bears can have an impact at certain times. Steller's eiders are here. The bulk of the population is farther south in Kamishak Bay. So like I said, we're at the northern end of this wintering area, northern part of Kamishak Bay. And we did not see any kittlets as merlets, but habitat is appropriate for the species, and they stage nearby after breeding. So now I'm going to talk about the mammals, and this is really where a lot of the endangered species are, threatened and endangered species. And again, we did 8 boat-based surveys and recorded 2,400 marine mammals of at least 5 species, 26 helicopter-based surveys, and had over 11,000 animals of at least 5 species, and 43 fixed-wing surveys that were concentrating exclusively on harbor seals over the 3-year period. Again, I'm going to try to talk about where I think I have the better data set and emphasize that to try to explain how I think the system works. So over our 26 helicopter-based survey periods, the area was dominated by sea otters, second by harbor seals, and everything else occurs in extremely low numbers. So it really is like we saw with the sea ducks versus waterfowl. We have a system that switches seasonally from being a harbor seal dominated system to being a sea otter dominated system. And this shows you the species composition. Again, you have blue bars and you have red bars. The blue bars are sea otters, which move into this area in very large numbers in fall, winter, and spring, and they start moving out in the summer, and the system becomes dominated numerically by harbor seals. Now, we to some extent with the helo data, we undercounted them. We tried to minimize the chances of disturbance. And so they are undercounted, but we also felt that we had much better data based on the harbor seal fixed-wing surveys. Now, there are some other species that occur there. Stellar sea lion. Sometimes in the spring we'll see a fair number. And my suspicion is that they are showing up around the time the herrings started in the old days to come in here in large numbers. They seem to be a spring phenomenon in particular. We see a few in the fall, but they really seem to be in this area in the spring. This is really out of the bulk of the main range of stellar sea lions. Even the National Marine Fisheries Service doesn't bother coming into Cook Inlet to try to census them when they're doing these large-scale aerial survey photography trips, because it's really marginal habitat for them. So what we do is we see just a few of them overall. We do see harbor porpoises, and occasionally we've seen beluga whales. We see a similar system for the boat-based data. In the summer, it is a harbor seal system. In the fall and winter, you start seeing a lot more sea otters. Now, there's a pretty good population of sea otters in Kamishak Bay that moves seasonally. During the spring and summer, they retreat south into central and southern Kamishak Bay. And as summer turns to fall, the weather gets worse. Lower Kamishak Bay, like I said, is a pretty tough place. It's very exposed. They start to spread out and move northward into that part of Cook Inlet, actually, that becomes colder. So it's a tougher place for them, but these big bays provide more protection, I think, for these seasonal movements. And then in the spring, so they hang out in the bight and in these bays, and then in the spring they move back out, and most of the animals leave the area and go back down into southern part of Kamishak Bay. Again, you can see in the offshore data, you can see harbor porpoises in the spring. Again, I think they're associated with these runs, perhaps of herring and or eulicon, stellar sea lions in yellow, and so on. But the offshore data, you can see that really overall the offshore area is dominated by large numbers of sea otters. Richness doesn't really get you very well with marine mammals because there's only about 7 or 8 species in this area, so it's really hard to see much of a pattern. In most cases, you usually see 1 or 2 species. Our peak was on the boat-based surveys where we had up to 5 species in the nearshore area in the spring. But mostly you're talking 1, 2, sometimes 3 species that you'll see on a survey. But it's really hard to tease out any kind of a pattern. So I'm going to talk a little bit about harbor seals. There's some concern about them in the northern Gulf of Alaska. Some parts of the Gulf, their populations are stable or increasing, and other parts they seem to be decreasing. So we thought they were high enough profile that we needed to do some additional work on them. So as I indicated, Brian and Alex led this effort. This is to refresh your memory of where the main haulouts were. The main haulouts are on the Aniskin Islands, and then these islands out here, islands and reefs off the mouth of Iliamna Bay, this island and eastern Chinitna Bay, and then you have these mud flats and a few occasional rocks that stick up that are used by them. So these are the strata: Iliamna Bay, Aniskin Bay, the Aniskin Islands, and Chinitna Bay. Like I said, in 2005, this is when we did the most extensive surveying to get what the seasonal pattern was. And what we really did, if you look at this top number, which is the sum of all of the various strata together, you can see that there's a peak in late May, early June, and then a peak in late July. Or actually, this is, I think this is, yeah, this is the late July, early August period. You start seeing another one. This is a peak associated with pupping, and this is a peak associated with the molt, as Brian indicated, talking about the lake seals. You see a similar pattern out here, although the timing may not be exactly the same as what we see for the lake seals. And the other point is that by far, most of the seals that are in this area are hauled out on the Aniskin Islands. The rest of them occur in fairly low numbers on most of the other strata. 2007, we see a bump in June that's associated with pupping again, and we see this bump in August that's associated with the molt. So Alex, our statistician, did quite a bit of modeling, looked at a series of variables, and came up with the dates for the highest adjusted counts, when probably the peak number of seals are associated with these bays. And it ranged over the 3-year period between the 26th of July and the 16th of August. This is about a 20-day period when the largest numbers are hauled out in this area, and this is occurs during the molt. So our peak actual observed count was 1,410 seals in August of 2007. He looked at a series of variables that affect the haul out. The two that, when we combined all the data together, the two that were significant were Julian date and time for midday. Tidal stage, when you looked at individual years, was significant, but when you combined them, it did not come out. So we had to correct for these 2 factors, Julian date and time for midday, and then there's also a correction factor used for number of seals not hauled out based on some telemetry data. And our estimated peak at that time then was over 1,800 seals in this area, which is about 35% of all the seals that are estimated to occur in the western side of Cook Inlet. So it's a pretty substantial number of seals in this area. Okay, so the sea otter, this is, again, is species that's present all year. It's resident as a species, although individual animals probably move in and out of the area at various times. They occur in this area primarily in fall and winter, and this is the northernmost extent of the Kamishak Bay population. We've recorded a few up around into Chinitna Bay, but really this area, once you get into Chinitna Bay, you get a lot more ice coming down from northern part of Cook Inlet with the current. So this area tends not to have as much ice. However, like I said, You can have, in late February or March, we'll often have our coldest weather. February is the coldest, oceanographically, is the coldest month of the year in general in Alaska. And so February or March, what we often get is a high pressure system sitting over the whole state. It can become quite cold. There have been periods when they haven't even been able to fly the helicopters to do surveys out of Pebble because it's been so cold that it wasn't safe to do it. So we went out in February of 2006, and this is looking up Niskin Bay. The whole place was open except for way at the head. There was a little bit of ice. In March, we went out, and it was frozen all the way out to the mouth of the bay. And we went back out in April, and it had warmed up again. And this affects the movements of some of these marine mammals, especially sea otters, in and out of this area. So this shows you the data for the sea otters from 06 to 08 on the helicopter data. And what you see is that actually during the summer, you'll see a few, maybe 10 sea otters altogether in the entire area. But they really start moving into the area in November. Presumably, this is related to the fact that the population is being pushed northward by inclement weather in the southern part of Kamishak Bay, and they finally get up here in substantial numbers. You can see the numbers are a lot higher in December, and the peak is probably sometime December to early March is when you get the peak number, and this is the peak number that we have is over 1,400 animals in 2008. And then starting in March or April, they start moving out. You'll have a lot of periods when they start moving out by late March. And you can see here this low number that we had in 2006. This was when the bays were open. April, the bays were open. In March, this is when the entire bay was frozen. You can see that we had a much smaller number of sea otters in this area. So it really is that they like to go in here for protection, I think, to a great extent, but they're sometimes frozen out and have to move back out into the open part of Kamishak Bay. Again, these are some maps of distribution. Late summer, fall, you can see that at that time, the highest densities occur around the Niskin Islands. We had a few that actually made it all the way north into Chinitna Bay, but the bulk of them are out here in Kamishak and in the bays. By midwinter, they move into the bays in pretty substantial numbers, and you can see that by far the highest density is out here in the Niskin Islands again, also around White Gull Island at the entrance to Iliamna Bay, and up here in East Arm or in central part of Niskin Bay are the three main concentrations. There are very few that go up here into Chinitna in the middle of winter in particular. Like I said, I think they're pushed out of here by ice drifting down from northern part of Cook Inlet. And then in spring, March to May, they start moving out of the bays again. You actually start seeing some pretty large groups of animals pushing southward. But again, the Niskin Islands are the main concentration area all the way from fall through spring. And as you might expect, most of the animals occur outside of the bay, especially around these islands that are around the outer the mouths of the bay, White Gull Island, Black Reef, and the Niskin Islands. I just wanted to show you a map showing critical habitat for sea otters. This is showing in red, and you can see that basically this entire area is listed as critical habitat, which is anything within the 20-meter isobath. So it extends all the way across all of Kamishak Bay and around Augustine Island here. Stellar sea lion, as I indicated, this is pretty marginal habitat, and we don't usually see very many times we don't see any sea lions at all. I think our peak count was about 33 animals. It's pretty marginal habitat, and this is the data from our boat and helicopter based surveys. You can see that over here in the eastern part of the Niskin Islands, especially Big Rock, is the main area where they like to haul out. You do see them occasionally out on the boat-based surveys, especially the offshore surveys. And most of the records are in late winter and spring. Like I said, I think that it's associated with the herring runs or runs of some kinds of fish. These data match up nicely with historical data. Ted Otis of Fish and Game out of Homer has been very kind to give us access to these data that they do when they're flying herring surveys in this area. So some 25-year period from 78 to 2002. They recorded additional stuff besides herring, additional information besides herring. And you can see that even in those days, the Aniskin Islands were the main area where the stellar sea lions like to hang out. Okay, belugas and other species, it's listed as threatened. And we did not record belugas at all until 2007, fall of 2007. We knew that there were some previous records in the area. We didn't know much about them. There were some Fish and Game personnel up in Chinitna Bay in September of 2007, early September, and they were mapping some salt marshes. And they had a very large number of belugas come to visit them and swim around the boat. They had 25 to 30 animals, including a bunch of calves. There was a fisherman. We tracked down about third or fourth hand record and found a fisherman who was in Aniskin Bay in mid-September during a fishing season, and he had a group of about 12 in the bay then. And then we started seeing them in our late September and October surveys of 2007. We saw them both in Chinitna and Iliamna Bay during both those periods. We didn't see him again in 2008, but John Houghton, one of the fisheries biologists doing the marine fish and invertebrate work, saw some in Iliamna, saw two there. Now this area is what's called type 2 or winter habitat. Most of the belugas in Cook Inlet are concentrated north of the Narrows, especially in spring and summer. This is the calve up here. South of the Narrows is what they call wintering habitat that is occasionally used. And that's what I think we were seeing. We were seeing them in the fall. They were coming down, presumably following schools of salmon or other fishes. So these are all the records. This is the one that the Fish and Game folks had. This is the record that the fishermen had. Again, these circles mark the locations of these anadromous fish streams, especially salmon streams. And you can see that most of these records are pretty close to salmon streams. So I think that what there was just a group that came south, happened to come south in the fall of 2007, and they wandered around down here and found where the salmon streams were. And then they moved north again, presumably that following, they went somewhere else. They certainly moved out of our study area the rest of that winter, and then we didn't see them again, but there was one record John Houghton had here in fall of 2008. Again, this matches up fairly well with what the Fish and Game data indicate. Most of them that they had were in Aniskin Bay and a few in Iliamna Bay. And again, these are just the locations of the anadromous fish streams. Critical habitat for beluga is defined as everything within this type 2 habitat is everything within, it's either 2 or 3 miles of shore. And it's just an operational term that they use so that you know that you're either in or outside of critical habitat for belugas. Gray whale, as I indicated, we only saw one. They were delisted quite a few years ago. The population actually has exceeded historical population levels, and they've actually expanded their range northward now because the population's become so high into the Chukchi Sea, and they're even our records into the Beaufort Sea now. Okay, in summary, we recorded a total of 8 marine mammal species in this area, including an off-transect minke whale and then this one gray whale. The species composition, like I indicated, is dominated by one of 2 species. In the spring, summer, it's harbor seals, and in the fall and winter, it's sea otters. The other taxa that are there occur there in very low numbers, very sporadically. There's a seasonal pattern of species richness. The highest seems to be in the spring, and like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if this is associated with this spring run of herring, spawning herring. 5 of these species are of conservation concern: the sea otter, the sea lion, the beluga, gray whale, and harbor seal. The sea lions, like I indicated, they occur primarily in the spring and early summer. We do have some fall or winter records, but this really is marginal habitat for them. Cetaceans are rare overall. We've only had single records of minke whales and gray whales over this entire period. And then belugas occurred primarily in fall of 07, and we had one record in fall of 08. Otherwise, in all these various surveys, we never saw belugas. So I think that this area, they just occasionally wander into. It's not a a dramatically important area for them, I don't think. It is a pretty important area for harbor seals. Like I indicated, about 35–36% of all seals in western Cook Inlet occur in this area, and we have one record of a gray whale. And with that, I will close and thankfully stop talking.
Thanks, Bob. So we're a little bit early on our schedule, but lunch is here, so we're going to take an early break for lunch. We'll come back and do panel questions. Lunch is going to be 1 hour. We'll come back and do panel questions, and then later on we'll do questions from the public. So 1 hour break for lunch. Thanks.